The worst places to live in medieval times. Boring history for sleep. If you ever find yourself lying awake at night wondering what it would be like to live in the Middle Ages, let this be your gentle warning. Don't romanticize it too much. The food was bland, the plumbing non-existent, and your odds of dying from something preventable, like a toothache, were surprisingly high. But tonight, we're not just exploring medieval misery in general. No, we're narrowing it down to the most unlivable places in the entire medieval world. Because even in an era famous for pestilence, war, and suffering, some places really went above and beyond. Before we begin our slow descent into these charming hellholes, we need to define what makes a medieval location truly bad. After all, the entire time period could be considered a giant cautionary tale with a muddy moat around it. But for our purposes, we'll focus on 6 major factors that transformed otherwise tolerable places into waking nightmares: disease, warfare, climate, famine, politics, and infrastructure. Or, as you might come to think of them by the end of this journey, the 6 horsemen of medieval discomfort. Let's begin with disease. The medieval world was a bacterial buffet, and your immune system was the only bouncer. Spoiler, it usually failed. Before germ theory, most people believed disease came from bad air, evil spirits, or divine punishment. Sanitation was an abstract concept, and hygiene was optional at best. Many of the worst places to live were urban centers, because density meant faster disease spread. Cities like London or Marseille would periodically empty out due to plagues, only to fill up again like a clogged drain. Rats were constant companions, and water sources were often upstream from where waste was dumped. If your town had an open-air sewer, congratulations. It was probably one of the better ones. Next up is warfare. The medieval period was not known for its pacifism. Borders changed faster than you could update your parchment maps. Living in a place like the Holy Roman Empire, where everyone was technically in charge but no one was really in control, meant your village could get caught in the middle of a feud between rival princes, crusaders, or mercenaries with unpaid salaries. Constant warfare didn't just threaten your life. It disrupted trade, destroyed crops, and turned safe roads into ambush sites. And if you were in a region bordering a crusader state, you might find your town besieged every other decade just because someone had a theological disagreement 300 miles away. Climate plays a quieter but equally cruel role. If you were living in the Scottish Highlands, you'd face brutally cold winters and short, growing seasons. In the swamps of Flanders, you'd be damp for so long you'd start to wonder if your skin was supposed to wrinkle that way. In Greenland, settlers literally froze and starved out of existence, stubbornly refusing to eat fish because of religious customs. Nature didn't care that you were trying to build a nice little stone cottage. Sometimes the earth just opened up and flooded your fields, or rained relentlessly until mold claimed your home. And let's not forget that from about 1300 onward, the Little Ice Age brought colder, harsher conditions across Europe. Your turnips weren't going to grow, and your sheep were not amused. Now let's talk famine. Food insecurity wasn't the exception, it was the rule. One bad harvest could lead to widespread starvation. 2 bad harvests. That's how legends of cannibalism and child selling began. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 struck much of northern Europe and left behind more ghosts than gravestones. Imagine watching your grain rot because of endless rain, while your livestock die off from disease, and then still having to pay taxes to your local lord, who demanded his cut no matter what. People ground bark into bread and boiled shoe leather into soup. If you lived in a place where food production was unreliable and trade routes were vulnerable, you weren't living. You were just delaying death one mouthful at a time. Which brings us to politics. A bad political structure could turn even fertile, disease-free areas into nightmares. Think of feudal lords as landlords, except with more swords and fewer lease agreements. If your region had a particularly ambitious duke, or a bishop with a fondness for inquisitions, you might find yourself imprisoned for saying the wrong thing, or simply taxed into oblivion. Some places, Like border towns in Castile or Crusader states in the Levant, were practically built on instability. Their entire political purpose was to serve as a buffer zone, which meant you were born into conflict and likely to die from it. If your region was a pawn in some larger power's game of chess, you could be marched over, burned down, or conscripted into service at any time. Bureaucratic chaos made things worse. Lack of centralized law enforcement meant your complaints were shouted into the wind. Finally, we come to infrastructure, or rather, the lack of it. A place with bad roads, no bridges, limited clean water, and no medical care wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. During times of crisis, such as war or plague, places without reliable infrastructure couldn't get help fast enough. A mountain village might go months without word from the outside world. A port city without a functioning quarantine system might become the next entry in a plague chronicle. And don't even think about fire safety. Most buildings were wood, roofs were thatch, and fire was a daily threat. If you lived somewhere with a single well and no drainage system, your water supply could be ruined with a single bucket of bad luck. So, as we tour the worst places to live in the Middle Ages, we'll be applying these 6 filters. Each location will fail in spectacular and often overlapping ways. Some places had all 6, true overachievers in medieval misery. Others specialized, a swampy war zone here, a frigid famine trap there. But no matter the combination, all of them had one thing in common. They made life feel like a long, slow crawl toward the grave, with very little room for joy, stability, or basic human dignity. And yet, people lived there. They were born there, raised families, built homes, told stories, and died under the same stars we see today. So while this may be a catalog of suffering, it's also a tribute, albeit a quiet, sleepy one, to the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Now that we know how to recognize a medieval nightmare, let's pack our mental satchels and visit some of the most unfortunate destinations history has to offer. First stop, the mud-caked alleys and smoke-choked air of medieval London. Just remember to hold your breath, because the Thames isn't the only thing that stinks. If you were looking for a place that embodied the very worst of medieval urban life, you wouldn't have to search far. Medieval London, proud, bustling, wealthy, and absolutely revolting, was a shining example of how even the richest cities could be utterly unbearable. It was a city of contradiction, a place of grandeur and grime, opportunity and overwhelming stench. If misery had a capital, London might have been it. Let's set the scene. Picture narrow, winding streets made of uneven stone slick with a mixture of mud, animal waste, and worse. The buildings, leaning inwards like gossiping old women, were built from timber and wattle, coated in a plaster that cracked easily and absorbed the surrounding filth like a sponge. They pressed so close together that the top stories nearly kissed, leaving the lower alleyways cloaked in an eternal shadow. Sunlight rarely reached the street, and when it did, it only made the smell worse. London's population had exploded after the Norman conquest. By the 14th century, it was one of the largest cities in Europe, a political and commercial hub teeming with merchants, craftsmen, nobles, beggars, clergy, and criminals. And yet, for all its importance, it was astonishingly ill-equipped to handle the people living there. There were few proper sanitation systems, fewer public services, and no real understanding of public health. The city grew faster than its infrastructure, like a swollen blister with no release. At the heart of London's misery was its complete and unapologetic lack of sanitation. Open sewers, known as kennels, ran down the sides of streets. These weren't charming little water channels. They were open-air drainage ditches into which people threw everything. Human waste, animal dung, dead cats, spoiled food, broken pots, and sometimes the occasional unlucky body. Residents emptied their chamber pots directly into the street, often with a polite shout of "Gardaloo" to warn passersby, assuming they bothered to give a warning at all. The River Thames, London's pride and lifeblood, was both a source of sustenance and a sewer. People drew drinking water from it. People also dumped waste into it, and fish still swam in it. You can guess. how that turned out. The smell in summer was said to be unbearable, a stew of decaying matter and human excrement that hung in the air like a greasy curtain. Disease thrived in this environment, and none were more infamous than the plagues that swept through the city like clockwork. The Black Death arrived in London in 1348 and killed nearly half the city's population within a year. Entire households were wiped out, and the living fled, if they could. Mass graves, known as plague pits, were dug on the outskirts, where bodies were thrown in without ceremony. The dead overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury them, and yet, life continued. The survivors filled the gaps. The city bounced back, only to be hit again by recurring outbreaks for the next 3 centuries. Some neighborhoods never fully recovered between waves. Londoners understood death intimately, but they didn't understand what caused it. Disease was seen as divine punishment, or bad air, miasma, which meant that few real improvements were made. When the city burned down in 1666, it was seen by some as a blessing, a violent, cleansing fire that finally chased the rats and fleas away. But that was hundreds of years after the medieval period. Back in the 13th and 14th centuries, fire was a constant threat, not a solution, because of the cramped wooden buildings and the widespread use of open flames for cooking and light. Fires were terrifyingly common. One careless candle or a poorly managed hearth could turn a whole block into ash. Firefighting, such as it existed, involved shouting a lot and forming a bucket chain. Insurance didn't exist, and rebuilding was expensive. For many, fire meant the end of everything they owned, including possibly their lives. The city even instituted ordinances to prevent certain building materials, but enforcement was as inconsistent as medieval weather. And speaking of the weather, it didn't help. London was damp. Rain pooled in the streets, mixing with the existing sludge and forming puddles that could swallow a shoe, or worse. In winter, frost covered the filth, giving it a momentary sense of cleanliness, before thawing back into horror. In summer, the heat brought flies and hastened decay. No season was safe. Each simply offered its own flavor of suffering. Overcrowding only made things worse. Houses were subdivided, rooms were rented out, and entire families lived in single-windowed spaces, the size of closets. Privacy didn't exist. The wealthy retreated behind stone walls, or into manors further from the center, but the poor were crammed in shoulder to shoulder. Public bathhouses did exist, though not always for bathing. Diseases like leprosy, smallpox, and syphilis spread quickly, especially in the poorest neighborhoods. The smell of the city was so bad that visitors from abroad commented on it. Though many cities had similar problems, London was in a class of its own. And then there was crime. A city this chaotic, this packed, was a paradise for thieves and cutthroats. Nighttime was especially dangerous. With no streetlights and few patrols, London at night was a different world. People were robbed in alleys, assaulted in the dark, or worse, even during the day. The markets could be a frenzy of pickpockets and con men. Punishments were brutal and public, but that didn't stop desperate people from committing desperate acts. Worse still, justice was arbitrary. The legal system was heavily tilted in favor of the wealthy and well-connected. If you were poor and accused of a crime, your odds of a fair trial were slim. Torture was not uncommon, and confessions were often extracted with a level of creativity that modern minds might associate more with horror films than with due process. Executions were a public affair, and heads mounted on spikes along London Bridge were a normal part of the skyline. If you were a woman, things were even grimmer. The city was a dangerous place, especially for the unmarried, the widowed, and the working poor. Brothels were technically legal in some periods, but the lines between sex work, exploitation, and survival were blurred at best. Women who defied gender norms, or even just annoyed the wrong neighbor, could find themselves accused of witchcraft or immorality. The city was not kind to anyone who didn't fit neatly into its social order. And yet, somehow, London thrived. Trade poured in through its ports. Guilds kept the economy running. Cathedrals were built. Plays were performed. People fell in love, had children, buried parents, and got on with the business of being human, Even while stepping over rats and coughing through clouds of coal smoke, there was a resilience in the city, a determination to exist no matter how foul the conditions. But make no mistake, if you had to pick a place to live in the medieval world, London was not your friend. It was a city of opportunity, yes, but only if you had strong lungs, a good immune system, and a talent for avoiding falling chamber pots. The streets ran with more than just rainwater, and the air told stories of death louder than any town crier ever could. So next time you think about visiting medieval England in your imagination, picture this: you're walking down a narrow alley, dodging piles of something you hope is just mud, while trying not to breathe through your nose. A rat scurries past, dragging something unidentifiable. You hear a shout from a window above. Something splashes. You're wet now, and it's not raining. If you ever thought a quiet, scenic escape might have made medieval life more bearable, let me gently direct your attention to Norse Greenland. It had all the makings of a rugged Nordic fantasy: crisp air, snow-draped mountains, a coastline carved by ancient ice, and zero cities for miles. But as you settle in beside your imaginary Viking hearth and dream of serene fjords and sealskin cloaks, know this: life here wasn't just hard, it was a slow, frost-bitten collapse into oblivion. Let's begin with the basics. Norse Greenland was established in the late 10th century by none other than Eric the Red, a man who had been exiled from both Norway and Iceland for murder. Not the coziest resume, he named the island Greenland as a marketing strategy to attract settlers, even though most of it was white, icy, and incredibly unforgiving. But the name worked. A few hundred people followed him, forming two main settlements on the southwestern coast: the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Settlement, of course, is a generous term. These were sparse clusters of turf-roofed farmsteads huddled against the wind. From the beginning, the Norse settlers were isolated, geographically, economically, and spiritually. It took weeks to sail from Iceland, and longer from mainland Europe. The route was treacherous, the weather uncooperative, and the reward on arrival was Greenland. There were no cities, no roads, and very few resources. Trade was difficult, sporadic, and completely dependent on summer sailing conditions. Once winter came, Greenland became a sealed box. If you were snowed in with no food, your prayers would have to last longer than your supplies. Yet for a time, the Norse managed. They brought with them what they knew: sheep, goats, cattle, and the dream of replicating Scandinavian farm life on this new land. They built long houses and tried to grow hay in valleys with limited soil. They relied heavily on animal husbandry because crop farming was nearly impossible. Winters were long and brutal. Summers were short and unpredictable. Even when it didn't snow, frost could hit in July. They managed to survive, barely. But survival came with strings attached. One of the most suffocating was religious control. The Norse settlers converted to Christianity relatively early, and the church held significant power in Greenland. Tithes were still expected, yes, even when there was barely enough food to feed your family. The church also discouraged certain types of food, particularly fish. Yes, you heard that correctly. Despite being surrounded by some of the richest fishing waters in the world, the Norse in Greenland often avoided eating fish because it was seen as lower class or spiritually suspect. Instead, they clung to imported European diets: bread, beef, butter, even when these were impractical and dangerous to sustain. This leads us to crop failure, one of the main slow-moving disasters that pushed Norse Greenland toward oblivion, because they insisted on living like continental Europeans in a subarctic climate. Their farms were always on the edge of ruin. Soil was thin and rocky, and overgrazing led to erosion. Once the delicate balance of land and livestock was tipped, recovery became nearly impossible. The hay harvest got smaller, winters got colder, and animals began to die. Without animals, there was no milk, no meat, no manure for fertilization. The entire system collapsed inward, like a dying star made of frost and stubbornness. And let's not forget climate change, specifically the Little Ice Age, a period of regional cooling that began around the 14th century. Just as the Norse were struggling with overfarming and dwindling trade, the weather turned even worse. Glaciers advanced, sea ice increased, making voyages to and from Greenland even more difficult. Some years, the harbors were completely frozen. Ships couldn't leave. No imports, no news, no help. The settlements became floating islands of cold silence. As things got worse, trade collapsed. The Norse had previously exchanged ivory from walrus tusks for iron, wood, and grain from Europe, but as demand for walrus ivory declined and sea routes shifted, fewer ships bothered to make the dangerous trip. Even the church began to care less. Bishops stopped visiting. Greenland faded from the political maps of Europe. By the 15th century, they were all but forgotten. Left behind, desperation crept in slowly. Skeletons from later settlements show signs of malnutrition, particularly among children. People were shorter, their bones marked with the signs of hunger and stress. Teeth wore down from chewing gritty food. There is even evidence that some families resorted to eating their livestock bones, scraping them to extract the last bits of marrow. Yet still, the Greenland Norse refused to adopt the ways of the native Inuit, who had thrived in Greenland for centuries. Unlike the Norse, the Inuit hunted seals, whales, and fish. They lived in harmony with the environment, not in defiance of it. But cultural pride, religious rigidity, or simple fear kept the Norse isolated, not just geographically, but intellectually. They did not intermarry. They did not learn new skills. They built European-style churches long after they should have been building better shelters. Some even buried their dead in full Christian fashion, in imported clothing and with imported goods, as though trying to hold on to a Europe that had already forgotten them. And so the Greenland Norse vanished. Not suddenly, like in a disaster movie, but slowly, like embers cooling in an abandoned hearth. The Western settlement disappeared first, possibly in the 14th century, when visitors from Iceland finally came to check on the eastern settlement in the 15th century. They found nothing but ruins and silence. The farms were empty, the churches abandoned, the people gone. What's perhaps most tragic is that they left so little behind. No great manuscripts, no sprawling cities, no final messages carved into stone, just bones, weather-worn buildings, and a cautionary tale. The silence of Norse Greenland is not loud or dramatic. It is the quiet end of a society that refused to adapt, starved by pride, frozen by climate, and forgotten by history until archaeologists began unearthing their story centuries later. So if you're ever tempted to romanticize life in a remote medieval settlement, far from the chaos of cities, surrounded by pristine nature, free to live in rustic simplicity, just remember Norse Greenland. Remember the long winters spent huddled inside damp wooden walls, the howling wind outside that never stopped, and the gnawing hunger that turned strong people into shadows. Remember that even the strongest farms can fall if they're built on pride and poor planning. And above all, remember this: when history forgets you, it forgets you completely. No fame, no glory, just cold stones under colder skies. Sleep well. Let's imagine for a moment that you're living inside one of the greatest cities the medieval world has ever known. Massive stone walls surround you, triple layered, with towers tall enough to scrape the sky. Golden domes glisten above churches, and mosaics shimmer inside sacred halls. The city pulses with centuries of culture, theology, and imperial pride. This is Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, the crossroads of East and West. And now, it's starving. Life in Constantinople could be dazzling, if you were lucky, but during its many sieges, life inside those famous walls became a slow, grinding horror. The city wasn't just attacked once, it was besieged again and again over the centuries. And with each siege, the suffering inside grew more intense, more desperate, and more unforgettable. Let's go back to one of the worst moments, the siege of 1453, when the Ottoman Empire finally broke through the city's defenses. But to understand the horror, we need to understand the build-up. By the 15th century, Constantinople was a ghost of its former self. The empire had shrunk to little more than the city and some scattered territories. Its once mighty population, which may have been 500,000 in its prime, had dwindled to perhaps 50 or 60,000. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruin. Gardens sprouted where houses once stood. And still, behind these majestic walls, people clung to hope. The city's famous Theodosian walls had stood for 1,000 years, fending off Huns, Arabs, Slavs, and Crusaders. The walls themselves were awe-inspiring, up to 40 feet high, with deep moats and strong towers spaced evenly along their length. For centuries, they had been the reason the city survived. But in 1453, the Ottomans brought something new: gunpowder. The walls that had stopped arrows and catapults were now being hit by massive cannons that thundered day and night. The very stones that had protected generations were shaken, cracked, and torn apart. Inside the city, it was no better. The siege cut off all supplies. The Byzantines had seen this before. Earlier in the city's history, during the siege of 717-718 by the Arabs, people had resorted to eating anything they could. There are records of rats, cats, dogs, leather belts, and even corpses being consumed to stay alive. And though that siege had ended in a Byzantine victory, the memories remained. When the final siege came in 1453, those memories returned as nightmares made real. Food ran out quickly. The city's grain reserves, already low, were rationed to stretch for weeks. But people couldn't eat pride, and the city's glory didn't grow crops. Prices soared. A loaf of bread became a luxury. Families traded heirlooms for rotting vegetables. Some tried boiling grass or mixing flour with sawdust. Those with connections might still get fish from the Golden Horn, until even the water routes were sealed off. Hunger gnawed at everyone, from soldier to priest to child. And with hunger came despair. Constantinople had once been the center of Christian civilization. Now, its citizens wandered through broken streets, past shuttered churches and crumbling mansions, looking for anything edible. Many believed the end of the world had come. Some retreated into prayer, packing the great Hagia Sophia and begging for divine intervention. Others gave up entirely, sitting down to wait for whatever came next. Meanwhile, the Ottomans kept pounding the walls. Day after day, the earth shook. Crews inside tried desperately to shore up the breaches, dragging broken stones and broken men into place. Weapons were low. Morale was lower. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. But still, they fought, because what else could they do? Let's pause and look more closely at what it was actually like to live through this siege. Imagine waking up to the sound of cannon fire, not once or twice, but every hour of the day and night. Your walls tremble, your windows rattle. You haven't eaten a real meal in days. Your neighbor, once proud and wealthy, is now digging through rubble for scraps. The city smells of smoke, fear, and unwashed bodies. Every face you see is drawn thin, eyes wide with exhaustion. No one speaks unless necessary. No one laughs. The great marketplaces are silent. The docks, once full of ships and spices, are empty. Fields just outside the walls are under enemy control, and the gardens inside have been picked clean. Chickens are gone. Pigeons have disappeared. Even the stray dogs, usually a nuisance, are nowhere to be found. You know why. Someone ate them. Then, the walls finally break. On May the 29th, 1453, after weeks of bombardment, the Ottomans stormed the breach. The city, weakened and weary, could no longer resist. Chaos erupted. Fighting spilled into the streets. The last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI, is said to have thrown off his imperial robes and fought to the death with his soldiers. But he was just one man. The fall of the city was swift and brutal. What followed was even worse. The Ottomans gave their troops 3 days of looting, a common practice after a siege. Constantinople was ravaged. Churches were plundered. Homes were burned. Men were killed. Women and children were taken as slaves. The Hagia Sophia, once the most magnificent church in Christendom, became a slaughterhouse before it was converted into a mosque. The sounds of singing turned to screams. The city that had withstood centuries of attack fell in less than a day. But this was just the end. Earlier sieges had brought their own misery. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was attacked by fellow Christians, Western European crusaders, who had originally planned to liberate the Holy Land, but instead turned their fury on the Byzantine capital. They sacked the city with even more zeal than the Ottomans would. 2 centuries later, the Crusaders looted the city's wealth, desecrated its churches, and committed atrocities that shocked even their contemporaries. The Byzantine Empire was fractured, and Constantinople would spend decades under Latin rule. Its splendor dimmed and its dignity shattered. No matter the invader, Arab, Latin, Ottoman, the story was always the same for the people trapped inside. The hunger, the fear, the betrayal of the very walls they trusted. Constantinople's citizens lived on a knife's edge, knowing that one day the defenders might fail, and when they did, no one would be spared. And yet, even during its darkest days, the city tried to maintain a sense of civilization. People still attended liturgies. Scholars still copied manuscripts. Traders still haggled over prices, even if those prices were for moldy cheese. Life tried to go on, even as the walls cracked and enemies waited outside. There is something profoundly human about the way Constantinople endured. It wasn't just stone and gold. It was people, thousands of them, who held out hope long after reason said they shouldn't, who planted tiny gardens between ruins, who sang hymns in the shadow of cannon fire, who died believing their city would never fall. But fall it did, again and again, and with every fall, someone inside ran out of food, ran out of faith, or simply ran out of time. If you had to pick a place to not be during a medieval siege, Constantinople would top the list. It was a magnificent cage, a golden coffin, a place where history lingered like smoke but never promised survival. So sleep now, and dream not of walls and glory, but of quiet fields, empty of armies, and kitchens filled with something more than boiled shoe leather. Because when Constantinople fell, it wasn't just a city that was broken, it was the people inside, starving to death while listening to the last echoes of empire. Close your eyes and imagine an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Warm winds, golden limestone cliffs, and deep blue waves stretching in every direction. Birds wheel overhead. The sun is always shining. It looks like a postcard, peaceful, beautiful, serene, but behind the postcard was a fortress, a prison in paradise. Welcome to Malta under the rule of the Knights of St. John, a place where the walls were thick, the rules were thicker, and escape was more of a spiritual concept than a physical possibility. Malta is small. Even today, the whole island is barely visible on a map. In the medieval period, it was a strategic speck of stone between Europe and North Africa. Because of this, it was fought over, bargained for, and passed around like a well-fortified pawn in a never-ending chess game of empires. But in 1530, it landed in the hands of the Knights Hospitaller, also known as the Knights of St. John. These weren't just knights. They were a militant religious order, part monastic brotherhood, part military machine, and for nearly 250 years, Malta was theirs. Now, being ruled by warrior monks might sound exciting, or at least orderly, but the reality was much less romantic. The knights transformed Malta into a military fortress, and everything on the island, from the architecture to the daily routines, reflected that transformation. They built vast walls, dug moats, planted batteries, and carved the capital city of Valletta into a stone labyrinth of defense. It was one of the most heavily fortified places in the world. But for the average Maltese peasant or townsperson, life inside this stone womb was stifling. The Knights of St. John were celibate, upper-class Europeans who spoke French, Italian, and Spanish, and largely viewed the native Maltese as lower class, rustic, and expendable. Local people were subject to strict religious controls, economic hardship, and a near-total lack of political autonomy. The knights ruled the island as a theocratic oligarchy, combining the authority of a monastery with the discipline of a military camp. And they weren't exactly interested in democracy. Religion under the knights was not a matter of choice. It was Catholicism or nothing. Every aspect of life was infused with piety, doctrine, and ceremony. Mass was mandatory. Blasphemy could get you fined, flogged, or worse. Public displays of faith were required, especially during processions and feast days. There was no escaping the dominance of the church, Not in the courtroom, not in the schools, not even in your own home. Confession was expected, obedience was assumed. And then there were the inquisitors. Yes, Malta had its own branch of the Roman Inquisition, a permanent tribunal that investigated heresy, moral corruption, and anything that hinted at deviation from Catholic orthodoxy. The inquisitor lived in a grand palace in Burgos and had the power to summon anyone, noble or peasant, for questioning. Gossip, rumors, or a neighbor's grudge could land you in a dark cell beneath the palace. Torture was allowed, though officially regulated. Punishments ranged from penance and public shaming to imprisonment or exile. The Inquisition files, still preserved, are filled with ordinary people terrified into confession for things like missing church, reading banned books, or speaking carelessly during wine-fueled evenings. Meanwhile, the knights lived lives of relative luxury, though monastic in theory. Many of them indulged in extravagance. Lavish palaces, feasts, imported wines, and silks were not uncommon within the walls of Vada. The island's resources, particularly grain, livestock, and taxes, were funneled toward the upkeep of the knights and their military projects. The local population shouldered the cost of this grand fortress lifestyle, but received few of the benefits. Life for the average Maltese farmer or fisherman was harsh. The island's rocky soil was difficult to cultivate. Fresh water was scarce. Most food had to be imported, especially during droughts or sieges. The population suffered from malnutrition, disease, and chronic overwork. Pirates and corsairs, especially the Ottoman-aligned Barbary pirates, frequently raided the coasts, taking entire villages as slaves. If the pirates didn't get you, the taxes might. Peasants paid multiple levies, to the order, to the local clergy, and to landowners. And speaking of slavery, Malta under the Knights was a hub for the Mediterranean slave trade. The Knights themselves operated galleys, or warships powered by hundreds of slaves, many of them Muslims captured during raids or battles. These slaves were chained to benches, forced to row endlessly in brutal heat, and were frequently beaten or killed if they faltered. In the cities, slave markets operated in the open. For a devout Christian military order, the line between salvation and exploitation was very, very thin. Now let's talk about freedom of movement. It didn't really exist. As Malta grew more fortified, it also grew more claustrophobic. Every harbor was guarded. Every street had soldiers. Every major city was enclosed in thick, unscalable walls. The roads were narrow. The watchmen were vigilant. Spies and informants were everywhere. You couldn't sail away without permission, and desertion was punishable by death. If you were born on the island, chances were high that you would die on the island, whether you liked it or not. During times of siege, such as the Great Siege of 1565, things became even more unbearable. The Ottomans, determined to crush the Knights once and for all, landed a massive invasion force. Malta became a battlefield. Civilians were caught between cannon fire and starvation. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, water poisoned. Vada and its surrounding cities turned into fortresses full of dying soldiers, wounded civilians, and the ever-present stench of rot. The siege lasted for months, and though the Knights ultimately won, the price was enormous. Thousands died. The fields lay in ruin. The island never truly recovered. And yet, even in times of peace, daily life was rigid and repetitive. The bells of churches marked every hour. There was a dress code, a prayer schedule. The calendar was filled with feast days and fasts, all enforced by church and state alike. Artistic expression was limited to religious themes. Literature was censored. Music was sacred. There was little room for deviation, imagination, or dissent. Women, especially, had almost no power. Their roles were tightly controlled, centered around chastity, obedience, and service. Unmarried women had few options outside the convent, and even marriage was subject to approval by family and clergy. Legal rights were minimal. Education was rare. Most women lived and died in quiet anonymity, hidden in shadows cast by grand churches and stone walls. And all the while, the sea glittered just beyond the ramparts, as if mocking the people trapped inside. Tourists today marvel at Malta's beauty, but for medieval inhabitants, that beauty could feel like a gilded cage. The architecture was glorious, but it wasn't built for comfort. It was built for defense, for control, for domination. So if you had to pick a medieval postcard to live in, Malta under the Knights of St. John might not be your dream destination, unless you enjoy being constantly surveilled, spiritually micromanaged, economically exploited, and physically penned in by limestone and theology. And still, people endured. They married, they prayed, they fished and planted, and told stories. Some even found ways to carve out joy in the margins, festivals, music, secret jokes, but they did it all under the shadow of an unyielding order. The same order that promised salvation while chaining men to galley oars. So sleep now, dream of wide fields, open gates, and skies without watchtowers, because sometimes paradise is only beautiful until you realize there's no door leading out. Imagine a place where your boots never fully dry, where the ground squelches under every step, where fog clings to your clothes, and mildew stains your soul. This is Flanders in the Middle Ages, a low-lying patchwork of swamps, bogs, rivers, and miserable weather, nestled between what is now Belgium and northern France. Today it might be charming, a place of chocolate and Gothic cathedrals, but in the medieval period, Flanders was a soggy, disease-ridden cauldron of warfare, poverty, and slow, damp suffering. Flanders was a wealthy region, yes, but that wealth came at a price. The cloth trade boomed here, making cities like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres vital commercial centers. But behind the merchant prosperity, countless peasants and artisans lived and died in some of the worst environmental and political conditions in Europe. Let's walk through it slowly, gently, like someone tiptoeing across a marsh, because to live in medieval Flanders was to always feel like you were sinking. Let's start with the land itself. Much of Flanders was marshland, a soggy plain crisscrossed by rivers like the Lys and the Schulp. Rainfall was abundant, drainage was poor. Much of the land sat only slightly above sea level. Dikes and canals were built to keep the water out, but they required constant maintenance. When they failed, entire fields flooded, crops were ruined, and homes were swept away. In wet years, and there were many, villages were reduced to islands surrounded by stinking water. The unrelenting dampness had consequences. Mud caked everything. Walls molded, straw bedding turned sour, clothes mildewed in trunks. Rats and lice thrived, and in this constant state of wet, diseases found a perfect home. Malaria, yes, malaria, was common in the medieval swamps of northern Europe, known then as Ock. It brought waves of fever and chills that left people too weak to work and too poor to stop. Then came dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne plagues that spread through the tainted wells and floodwaters. Children died young. Adults lived in a haze of exhaustion. Cemeteries grew soggy with grief. If the marsh didn't kill you, the war might. Flanders was rich, which meant everyone wanted a piece of it. The region sat at a crossroads of empires. France, the Holy Roman Empire, and England all had claims or ambitions here. The result was near constant conflict from the 11th century onward. Sometimes it was foreign kings battling over borders. Sometimes it was local nobles turning cities into battlegrounds. And sometimes it was the townspeople themselves rising up in revolt, like during the Flemish Peasant Revolt or the Ghent uprisings. The clamor of hoofbeats and the crackle of burning thatch were as common as rainfall. The 100 Years' War made everything worse. Though centered in France, it spilled over into Flanders repeatedly. English armies clashed with French and Flemish forces. Sieges destroyed towns. Armies requisitioned food and left famine in their wake. And just when things couldn't get worse, the Black Death rolled in. Flanders, with its crowded cities and poor sanitation, was a perfect breeding ground. Entire villages emptied. Work stopped. The damp air now carried not just moisture, but death. And yet, the people still worked, because they had to. Peasants toiled in waterlogged fields, trying to coax crops from mud. Drainage ditches had to be dug and cleaned by hand. Oxen plodded through thick soil. Seed rotted in the ground. Every harvest was a gamble, Too much rain, and the crops drowned. Too little, and they withered. There was no ideal year, only less bad ones. Even in the cities, life was hard. Textile workers, especially weavers and fullers, lived in cramped quarters near the rivers. The fulling process, which involved pounding cloth in a mixture of water and urine, made entire neighborhoods reek. The dyeing industry used dangerous chemicals. Work hours were long. Guilds controlled everything, from what tools you could use to how much you were allowed to sell. If you fell outside the guild system, you were unemployed. If you spoke against it, you might be banished. Flanders was rich, but only for a few. And always, the swamps waited. Travel between towns was a misery. Roads became bogs. Horses slipped. Wagons broke. A journey of 10 miles might take a full day. Bridges washed away in spring floods. Ferrymen gouged desperate travelers. Merchants hired armed guards to fend off bandits who prowled the forest edges. And when you finally arrived in town, you might find it under siege, under curfew, or underwater. Add to all this the mental strain of life in a swampy wart zone. Chronic dampness doesn't just affect the body, it wears down the mind. There's something quietly oppressive about waking each day to a gray sky, shivering in wet clothes, trudging through mud to dig a ditch you know will just refill tomorrow. People lived with a constant low-grade dread, not of dramatic disaster, but of endless, grinding discomfort. No rest, no escape, just soggy misery. Then came winter. The marshes froze. The rivers became sheets of ice. But the damp didn't go away. It simply chilled. Clothes stiffened. Water jugs cracked. Food spoiled. Salted fish and black bread were daily fare. Vitamin deficiencies led to scurvy, rotting teeth, bleeding gums, and joint pain. In the cities, heating fuel was scarce. Chimneys smoked. People huddled together for warmth. Fires sometimes raged out of control, consuming whole blocks of half-timbered homes. Let's take a moment and picture the inside of a home, a peasant's hut in a lowland village. The floor is dirt. The walls are wattle and daub, with water stains creeping upward. The thatch roof drips on bad days and collapses under snow on worse ones. Smoke from the fire has blackened the beams. The bed is a lumpy sack of straw. You hear coughing from the next room. You smell mold. Your knees ache from digging peat all day. Your boots haven't been dry since September. Outside, a dog whines in the fog. You hear a distant bell. Maybe it's time for evening prayer. Maybe it's the city watch announcing another curfew. Maybe it's just the wind. Even the church offered little relief. Priests were often more interested in maintaining order than comforting souls. Tithes were collected ruthlessly. Confession was a legal necessity. Theological disputes, like those between Catholics and emerging reformers, turned into social unrest. Heresy trials occasionally swept through, fueled by fear and whispers. There was no sanctuary, just rules, endless rules. And still, the people endured. They built communities around survival. They patched dikes together. They held fairs, even in the mud. They raised children, even knowing how many would die. They found beauty in the marsh violets, and strength in one another's company. They made music. They told stories. They found tiny, flickering lights in the mire. But if you were looking for a place to feel dry, safe, or untroubled in the Middle Ages, Flanders was not it. Its swamps were fertile, but not friendly. Its cities were powerful, but perilous. Its people were resilient, but rarely rested. It was a place where the land itself seemed to press against you, wet and unyielding, whispering that no matter how much you build or pray or dig, you will sink eventually. So sleep now. Let the mist roll past. Let the marshes fade. Imagine solid ground under your feet, dry socks, a warm hearth. Because in medieval Flanders, even a simple thing like a dry night's sleep was rare enough to dream about. Close your eyes. Picture rolling green hills, dramatic cliffs, and cold mist drifting down through valleys. There's a loch nearby, still and black as oil. A deer disappears into a patch of heather. The wind howls low over the peaks. It's beautiful here, but it's not gentle. Welcome to the Scottish Highlands in the Middle Ages, a place of breathtaking nature, and a life so hard it could crush your bones before you reached 40. The Highlands were not for the faint of heart, and that's putting it mildly. Life here wasn't just shaped by the environment, it was dictated by it. You didn't live in the highlands, you endured them. The weather alone made survival a daily struggle. Long, dark winters, heavy rains that lasted for weeks, fog that never seemed to lift. Crops were stunted by cold winds and rocky soil. The mountains were stark and beautiful, yes, but they weren't hospitable. Let's begin with the land itself. The highlands were wild, untamed, and mostly uncultivated. Much of the soil was poor, thin, acidic, and littered with stones. Arable land was scarce, usually found only in narrow glens or small patches near rivers. You couldn't just stick a seed in the ground and hope. Farming here took constant effort and a lot of luck. Most families scraped by on a grim routine of growing oats and barley, and when the harvest failed, which it often did, they turned to milk, roots, or whatever game they could catch. There were no bustling medieval cities here, no cobbled streets or thriving markets. Instead, the highlands were dotted with small, scattered communities called clochans, clusters of stone huts often shared by extended families and livestock. Roofs were made of heather thatch, floors were packed dirt. Smoke from the hearth had nowhere to go, so it gathered in the rafters and stung your eyes. Water came from nearby streams, often muddy and full of silt. Hygiene was more of an aspiration than a habit. And yet, even the weather and the poverty weren't the worst part of Highland life. That honor goes to the clan system. At first glance, the clans seem romantic, tartan patterns, heroic ballads, rugged loyalty to kin and chief. But on the ground, the reality was far rougher. Clans were not just families, they were factions, and their loyalties ran deep and often violently. A Highlander's allegiance was to their clan first, and that often meant raiding, feuding, and blood vengeance. If you were born into a powerful clan, you might be slightly better off, but if your family was small, or your name was from a rival group, life could be very precarious. Clan rivalries could erupt over the smallest insult or land dispute, escalating into years of fighting. Raids were common, livestock stolen, homes burned, men killed in retribution for some slight your grandfather may have committed decades earlier. The most infamous of these was the Highland cattle raid, where entire villages would wake to find their cattle missing, driven off into the mist by rival clans under cover of darkness. And then there were the bonds of manrant, oaths of loyalty sworn to a more powerful clan in exchange for protection. These weren't free. They often came with obligations to fight in wars or carry out feuds not your own. You could be drawn into bloodshed over land you'd never seen, for a chief you'd never met. Your village might become a battlefield for someone else's pride. And of course, justice, if you could call it that, was local and personal. There were no police, no neutral courts. Your clan chief was judge, jury, and, occasionally, executioner. If a feud broke out, it was settled with swords, not signatures. If a crime was committed, compensation was paid in cattle, not coin. If someone refused to pay, that was another reason for a raid. An endless cycle. Outside clans. The Scottish crown had only a loose hold on Highland affairs. Kings in Edinburgh issued laws and proclamations, but in the glens, those words didn't travel far. The Highlands were considered unruly, uncivilized, and wild. They were often left alone until something went terribly wrong. Then came the royal armies, sent to pacify and punish. The people of the Highlands were caught between being ignored and being invaded, neither of which offered much relief. Then there was the problem of isolation. Roads were rare. Travel between settlements could take days. Mountains and rivers made movement slow and dangerous. A merchant might visit once a year, if at all. If someone got sick, the healer in the next glen might as well have been on the moon. News traveled slowly. Goods were scarce. People relied on what they could grow, catch, or barter for. Winters were the worst. Not just cold, but cold with teeth. Blizzards howled down through the mountains. Animals froze in the fields. Families huddled together in smoky rooms, rationing whatever dried meat or oats they had left. Starvation wasn't a possibility, it was a pattern. Some winters, children simply disappeared from village records, too young to survive, too common to mourn in ink. Let's not forget the diet. Oats, more oats, sometimes dried fish. If you were lucky, cheese. When there was meat, it was boiled into a thin broth and shared. Berries in summer, if the birds didn't get them first. No spices. No bread unless you grew your own barley and ground it yourself. The closest thing to a treat might be a bit of honey, if someone had bees. Otherwise, hunger was your constant guest. Thin bodies, swollen joints, scurvy gums, the cost of a life in the hills. And what of the women? Their lives were no easier. They worked the land, managed the home, tended to livestock, gave birth without midwives, and often buried half the children they bore. There were no schools, no doctors, no books. A woman's role was labor, silence, and survival. If a raid came, she might be left a widow. If a feud started, she might be part of the negotiation, married off to forge a fragile peace. Her voice was rarely recorded. Her suffering, even less so. Even religion offered little refuge. The Highlanders were often slow to conform to the official church. Old pagan beliefs lingered, woven into daily life. Holy wells, curses, protective charms. Some of these practices were tolerated, others were condemned as heresy. Priests might visit only occasionally. When they did, it was to collect tithes or chastise the people for not attending Mass often enough. There was little comfort, just obligation. Still, in the Highland spirit, there was endurance. Songs were sung by Firelight, stories passed down through generations. A child might hear tales of giants in the mountains, selkies in the lochs, and battles fought by ancient heroes. Even the clan feuds were remembered with grim pride. It was a culture of survival, hardened by the land, shaped by the cold, and bound together by blood and tradition. So if you're wondering what made the Scottish Highlands one of the worst places to live in medieval times, it wasn't one thing, it was everything. The weather, the land, the clans, the isolation, the hunger, the fact that even the act of boiling a pot of oats might be interrupted by an enemy raid, or a blizzard, or both. It was beautiful, yes, but so is the edge of a knife. So sleep now, let the wind fade into silence. Imagine warmth, safety, and quiet, because in the medieval Highlands, all three were as rare as a peaceful day between clans. Take a breath, a slow one. Now imagine that breath stinging the inside of your nose. It's damp, heavy, and acrid, like the air in a cave where the walls sweat salt, and the earth groans just out of earshot. You're hundreds of feet below the surface. You haven't seen sunlight in days. This is no dream. This is medieval Poland. And you work in a salt mine. More precisely, you're in the Wieliczka salt mine, just outside Krakow, one of the oldest and most famous salt mines in the world. By the High Middle Ages, it was already a sprawling underground labyrinth. But for the people who actually worked here, miners, haulers, cutters, and servants, this place was less a marvel and more a living tomb. A place where your spine bent early, your teeth rotted fast, and your lungs filled with things you couldn't name. In the medieval world, salt wasn't just seasoning, it was essential. Salt preserved meat, it tanned leather, it was used in dyes, cheese making, and even some forms of early medicine. So, salt wasn't a luxury, it was survival. And because salt meant survival, salt meant profit. That made salt mines like Wieliczka a gold mine, just not for the men who chipped away at its walls every day until their hands bled. Let's begin with the descent. To reach the salt veins, miners descended by wooden ladders, sometimes over 300 feet deep. That's 30 stories, in total darkness, holding nothing but an oil lamp. If your foot slipped, that was it. No safety harness, no handrails. If the ladder cracked or your grip failed, your bones shattered on the stone floor below, and you didn't come back up. Once underground, the air turned against you. It was wet, heavy, and tinged with sulfur. Not enough oxygen, too much dust. You worked by flickering torchlight, or the dull glow of oil lamps, which smoked and stung the eyes. The longer you stayed, the harder it got to breathe. Miners coughed up blackened mucus. Their chests rattled when they spoke, but stopping wasn't an option. Tools were crude. Picks, chisels, shovels, mallets. Your job might be to carve out a block of salt the size of a cow, and do it with nothing but a wedge and a dream. The salt was hard, crystalline, and beautiful, but indifferent to your suffering. Your hands blistered, your back screamed. You stooped for hours, muscles cramping, breath shallow, sweat trickling into your eyes. There were no shifts. You worked until the overseer told you to stop. Let's talk about toxic exposure. Salt dust, when inhaled daily, does damage. It scars the lungs, ruins the sinuses, and causes slow, steady respiratory failure. Not all at once, just gradually, like a creeping shadow. Salt also dries out your skin, cracks it open. Miners suffered from chronic skin infections, split knuckles, bleeding sores. And then there were the chemical byproducts, hydrogen sulfide gas and other nasty surprises, lurking in pockets within the earth. They made you dizzy. Some were flammable, some were lethal. In some parts of the mine, water seeped in from above. If it wasn't drained, it pooled and mixed with salt, creating brine pits, unseen hazards where you could slip, drown, or suffer chemical burns. In the winter, this water was ice cold. In the summer, it grew warm and sour, giving off a sickly stench. Rats nested near the storage chambers, and sometimes fell into the brine, floating belly up for days before being noticed. And yet, people kept coming, because the alternative was often worse. Miners were usually poor villagers, pressed into labor by royal decree or economic necessity. In Poland, salt mines were owned by the king, and working in them was considered a kind of national service. That meant you didn't have a choice. If you were born in a salt town, chances were good you'd either marry a miner, give birth to one, or become one yourself. Women didn't mind, but they cooked for the crews, mended their clothes, and sometimes carried salt to the surface in baskets strapped to their backs. And the pay, modest, if you were lucky, non-existent, if you were indebted. Most of what you earned went to rent, bread, and tools. Injuries weren't compensated. If you lost a finger, that was your problem. If your friend died in a collapse, the tunnel might be sealed off and blessed, but then work resumed the next day. Salt doesn't dig itself. Accidents were common. Collapses, cave-ins, falls from ladders. Sometimes the roof simply gave out with a groan and a burst of dust, crushing everything beneath it. Recovery was slow. There were no rescue teams, just your fellow workers, who might dig through rubble by hand in the dark, hoping to find a limb or a face they recognize. The most feared sound in the mine was silence. Not the usual hush of distant picks or low voices, but a sudden, complete absence of sound. That often meant a collapse was coming, or had already happened. The air would shift. A trickle of dust might fall from above. You would freeze, say a prayer, and hope the mine let you live. Let's pause now and picture the daily rhythm. You wake before dawn, eat a crust of rye bread, and drink thin beer or water. You descend into the earth with your crew, boots slick with dew. You work until your arms no longer respond. You emerge hours later, dirt covered, salt streaked, coughing. You might eat again, if food is available. Then you sleep. Repeat, repeat, repeat. This was your life. There were no Sundays off, no holidays underground. The mine didn't care. Still, some workers clung to ritual and belief. Salt was sacred, after all. It preserved life. It was used in holy water, in baptisms, in blessings. Miners carved chapels underground, small sanctuaries lit with candles, where they prayed for safety and remembered the dead. In Wilichka, these chapels became famous, walls sculpted from salt, saints emerging from the stone, a kind of fragile beauty, made from the same thing that broke their bodies. And sometimes, there was humor, even in the gloom. Jokes about whose pick was duller, songs sung off-key, a bit of carved graffiti in a dark corner. The human spirit, quietly resisting the weight of rock and rule. But even the strongest spirit bends. Few miners lived long lives. Many were bent double by 40, their hands deformed, their teeth gone, their lungs weak, and they were replaced by sons, cousins, neighbors. The mine always needed more. Let's not romanticize it. The Wilichka mine is stunning, yes. Today it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists marvel at the salt chandeliers and underground lakes. But back then, It was a machine that ran on human pain. Every carved wall was made by someone who lost sleep, health, and family to the salt. Every tunnel bears silent witness to centuries of labor, with no holidays and no exit. And yet the people came, because salt was survival. And in medieval Poland, the mine was both curse and cradle. So close your eyes now. Let the torchlight fade. Let the tunnels quiet. You're above ground now. Safe. The air is clean. There's nothing to breathe in but peace. No ladders. No picks. Just rest. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let your thoughts drift to the distant past, where borders blurred and authority dissolved into mist. Imagine a small, half-forgotten village surrounded by dark forests, crooked hills, and crumbling paths. There are no city gates here, no knights to protect you, no king's law, no coin to jingle. You're on the very edge of something once called the Holy Roman Empire, if anyone even remembers the name. This is not the empire of marble halls or gleaming armor. It is the far edge, the outer rim, the place where maps fade and roads turn to mud. It is where you live, if you're unlucky. The Holy Roman Empire, for most of its life, wasn't really an empire in the traditional sense. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, abbs, free cities, and frontier settlements, each ruled by its own prince, count, bishop, or burgher council. Power didn't flow from the top down. It trickled sideways, evaporated, or disappeared entirely. And nowhere was this more obvious than on the outskirts. If you lived in one of these edge lands, in the marshy forests of Thuringia, or the jagged frontier between Saxony and Bohemia, you had no reliable authority. The emperor might technically rule over you, but he was hundreds of miles away, locked in a feud with the pope, or embroiled in politics in Frankfurt. You might be under the jurisdiction of a local baron, one who hadn't visited your region in 20 years. Maybe your village had been pledged as a fief to some distant monastery, which sent tax collectors but offered nothing in return. The result was a kind of political void. No infrastructure, no protection, and no one to help when things went wrong. And things went wrong often. Let's start with the roads, if they could be called that. Most were little more than muddy tracks, carved by ox carts and bare feet. There were no bridges, just planks across rivers or stone stepping paths that washed away in floods. Bandits waited in the underbrush. Wolves followed from the trees. If you needed to travel, you didn't do it alone, and you didn't do it after dark. When storms came, the roads turned to bogs. When snows came, they vanished altogether. Supplies ran out. News stopped arriving. A village might be completely isolated for months. If the crops failed that year, you simply ate less, or not at all. And then there were the laws, or rather, the lack of them. Justice was inconsistent, local, and often terrifying. If your neighbor stole your pig, you might have to appeal to a traveling judge, who wouldn't arrive for another year. Or maybe you had to bring your case before the local noble, who didn't care, or worse, favored your neighbor. Trials could involve ordeals, boiling water, burning irons, duels with clubs. Innocence was not assumed. Truth was determined by injury. Worse still, many of these fringe lands were perpetually contested. Borders shifted constantly. One year, you belonged to a Bavarian duke, the next, to a Bohemian warlord, then to some ambitious bishop, eager to collect tithes. These transitions brought new taxes, new rules, and new soldiers, and sometimes, no rules at all. Armies passing through didn't ask for food. They took it. Churches were looted, fields burned, homes turned inside out looking for silver or grain. Your life could be uprooted in an afternoon, not by nature, but by men with swords and horses. No empire protected you. The emperor couldn't even protect himself from his own electors. Let's talk about feuds. On the imperial fringe, power wasn't centralized, it was personal. Lords and families settled disputes with private war. A slighted noble might raise a militia and burn down his rival's village. You and your neighbors would be caught in the middle. Fields trampled, sheep stolen, children taken for ransom. These weren't kings battling for thrones. These were petty nobles fighting over old insults and water rights. Sometimes, villages tried to band together for protection. They built wooden palisades, appointed elders, formed alliances with other villages. But without support from a greater power, these defenses were fragile. All it took was one bad season, one ambitious robber baron, and the whole region could collapse into chaos. Speaking of robber barons, they were the scourge of the borderlands. These were local lords who realized that no one could stop them, so they didn't even try to follow the law. They built small fortresses, controlled the roads, and demanded tolls. If you couldn't pay, they took your wagon, or your daughter, or your fingers. They didn't just steal, they ruled by theft, and no one came to stop them. And the church. It was complicated. In many places, the church was the only functioning institution, but in the outskirts, even the clergy were stretched thin. A priest might visit once a month. There were few schools, no hospitals, and little charity. The church still demanded tithes, 1/10 of everything you had, but offered little in return. Some villages were so isolated that they developed strange blends of Christianity and pagan practice, not out of rebellion, but because no one was there to teach them otherwise. And still, you had to survive. That meant farming. The soil wasn't always good. Some regions were swampy, others rocky. You grew rye, barley, or turnips if you could. You raised pigs, because pigs could eat anything. Winters were brutal. Your house might be made of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof and one smoky hearth. You slept on straw. Your clothes were wool, coarse and stiff. If it rained, the roof leaked. If it snowed, the roof collapsed. And if you got sick, there was no doctor, just the village herbalist, or a prayer, or a slow decline. Fevers, dysentery, tooth rot, infections. They took people quietly. Sometimes entire families would vanish over a single season. A priest might record it, if you had a priest. There were no silver linings, no hidden prosperity. You lived day to day, hoping this wasn't the day your world unraveled. You planted, you prayed, you paid your taxes, you kept your head down. And in the distance, people spoke of an emperor, a man in robes, crowned with gold. But he didn't know your name. He didn't know your village. He ruled 1,000 places, but not this one. This place ruled itself, or rather, it failed to rule itself, every day. So now, as you drift into sleep, imagine the wind outside your hut, the stars above the trees, the faint crackle of your fire, holding back the dark. You're on the edge of the empire, and the empire doesn't care. But you are here, and you have survived. One more day. Let that be enough. Let it be quiet now. Close your eyes. Picture a pale, cracked landscape where the sun hangs like a burning coin above a horizon of dust. The wind is hot. The ground is dry. Everything smells like sweat and horses and iron. This is not a desert, not quite, but it wants to be. This is the edge of Castile in the 12th century, a borderland, an outpost, the ragged hem of Christendom, always fraying. Here, in this dry and dusty place, you do not live for long. You survive, if you're lucky, if you're strong, and if God wills it. This is the time of the Reconquista, a long, grinding, centuries-spanning struggle to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. It is not a neat war. It is not clean. It is not fought in well-organized lines with banners fluttering and trumpets blowing. No. This is a war of raids and reprisals, of frontier skirmishes and sudden ambushes, of burning, looting, and running. And you live in one of the many Castilian outposts, built to hold the line between Christian kingdoms and the lands of Al-Andalus. A few dozen families, a wooden palisade, a rough stone chapel, a well, if you're lucky. The town smells of goats, old blood, and drying hides. Your town is not a castle. It is a target. It is a temptation for raiders, mercenaries, and soldiers of every stripe. Some wear crosses, some wear crescents. All carry swords. Your walls are made of sun-dried bricks and faith. Your weapons are whatever you can afford. A rusted spear, a borrowed dagger, a bent bow strung with a cord made from your horse's tail. You are a farmer when the weather is good, a soldier when it is not. And the weather is rarely good. The heat bakes the land hard. Crops die in the field. Wells dry up. Dust clogs your nose and throat. You drink wine because the water makes you sick. You chew stale bread because it's all that's left. You work until your skin peels. You dig your own irrigation ditches, sweat slicking your arms, blistered hands grasping at a shovel made of wood and hope. But the real threat isn't the sun, it's the night. Because at night, the raiders come from the south. Small bands of Muslim horsemen ride out under cover of darkness. Or maybe it's Christian mercenaries turned outlaw, looking for easy prey. They don't care which god you pray to. They come for livestock, for food, for women, for gold. If you hear the hooves, it's already too late. Sometimes, the alarm is raised. A bell, a scream, a sudden torchlight. The town gathers what weapons it has and runs to the wall. You climb the tower, if your outpost is lucky enough to have one. You look into the dark. Shapes move. A flash of steel. An arrow thuds into the wood near your head. And then they're inside. There's no organized defense. No trained militia. Just farmers and herders with knives and faith. The fighting is brutal. It's in alleys, in doorways, in the dust. If you win, you count your dead. If you lose, the town burns. Survivors are taken south in chains, or left to starve. No one keeps records. No one sends help. These towns, hundreds of them, rise and fall with the seasons. One year, it is a thriving village. The next, a burned ruin. And then, slowly, it begins again. Someone builds a wall. A priest comes. A family plants grain. The cycle resumes. Why live here, you wonder? The answer is simple. You have nowhere else to go. Some are sent by kings, as colonists and warriors. Others come because land is promised. And land, in Castile, is everything. It means status, freedom, hope. But no one tells you that to own this land, you must bleed into it. Many of these border settlers are second sons, men without inheritance, seeking fortune. Some are penitents, atoning for crimes. Some are simply poor, desperate, and out of options. And the church encourages this. To die fighting the infidel is to gain absolution. To kill in God's name is to be sanctified. It is a sacred frontier, and a savage one. Your daily life is a rhythm of hard labor and harder vigilance. In the morning, you pray, you check the horizon, you patch the wall, sharpen your knife, train your sons to hold a sword. You teach your daughters how to hide in the cellar. You plant beans and barley. You sleep lightly. You listen for the wind. There is no luxury, no privacy. You sleep on straw, sometimes with livestock to keep warm. You cook over an open fire. Your clothes are sun-bleached and patched. You carry the dust of 100 prayers in your skin. Disease is constant. The heat breeds infection. Wounds rot. Flies swarm. There are no doctors, only faith, herbal remedies, and the vague comfort of saints, carved in wood above the altar. When the harvest fails, and it often does, you boil grass, you chew roots, you slaughter the last goat. Hunger becomes normal. You shrink, your skin pulls tight across your bones. And yet, life goes on. Somehow, there are weddings, quiet, nervous things. There are births, children born into dust, baptized with hope and worry. There are feasts, meager, but joyful, when the rains come or a raid is repelled. And there is music, faint, rough, played on a stringed instrument with 2 notes and a cracked drum. Laughter echoes, thin and dry. But above all, there is war. War shapes everything. It is not a campaign. It is a condition. It is the price of living where kingdoms meet and gods contend. It never ends. It only pauses. Some days, you fight beside a Castilian knight. Other days, you trade with a passing Berber merchant. Alliances shift. Enemies become neighbors. Neighbors become thieves. Morality bends. You do what you must. And the children, they grow up fast. By 10, they know how to use a bow. By 12, they've seen a man die. By 15, they've killed someone or watched a sibling taken. Their eyes hold stories that cannot be spoken aloud. Still, the church offers certainty. A priest reads Latin from a cracked Bible. He tells you this land will be holy again. He tells you to suffer well, for your suffering is seen. He blesses your sword. He blesses your wounds. He blesses your dead. And so you endure, one dry, blistering year at a time, because Castile is expanding, and someone has to be the tip of the spear. You do not live here because it is safe. You live here because you believe, or because you have nothing left to believe in. The outpost is your world. Small, dusty, dangerous, but it is yours. So let it all fade now. Let the desert wind fall silent. Let the clang of steel and the howls of raiders grow distant. You are behind the walls now. The watch is posted. The stars burn low above the chapel. You are safe, just for tonight. And for a place like this, that's everything. Close your eyes. Imagine a place not scorched by sun nor frozen by ice, but instead soaked through in every season. Imagine the feeling of dampness in your bones. Not a little moisture in the air, but a deep, creeping wetness that never leaves. Your clothes, your walls, your food, even your soul, saturated with the slow, constant breath of the river. Welcome to the Po River Valley, in the northern lowlands of medieval Italy. Fertile, yes, but cursed all the same. You live in a village just above, or sometimes just beneath, the waterline. There is a murky stream outside your door. Some days it trickles quietly, other days it rises fast and without warning. The Po River, Italy's longest, runs eastward from the Alps to the Adriatic Sea, but it does not run gently. It meanders, it floods, it swallows. It is the vein of life here and also its slow suffocation. Let us start, not with the people, but with the land itself. The valley is wide, flat, and low. That means when it rains in the hills, anywhere from the western mountains to the eastern edge, you will feel it. The water will come. It always does. It fills the fields. It bursts the banks. It trickles down from the foothills and pools on your floor. There are embankments, of course, muddy, half broken, shored up by whatever your village can spare. But these are not Roman aqueducts. These are dikes made of straw and prayer. When the river rises, it pulls the earth apart. When it recedes, it leaves behind a slurry of mud and rot. If you are lucky, the flood comes slowly. You can gather your things, move your chickens, stack your belongings on the roof beams. If you are unlucky, and most are, the water arrives with no warning, in the middle of the night, turning your home into a floating coffin. And when it's over, the real suffering begins, because the water never leaves cleanly. It leaves behind mosquitoes, breeding in standing pools, buzzing in clouds thick enough to choke a goat. And with the mosquitoes come fevers, strange ones, long-lasting ones. You don't know what to call them, but the old women whisper that the air is bad, that the ground itself is ill. You shake and sweat for days. You watch your children burn with fever. Some survive, others do not. And there is no doctor, only a priest, who blesses the water and says God works in mysterious ways. Let's talk about your home. It is built of mud brick and straw, with a thatched roof and no floorboards. Your feet press into damp earth each morning. The walls sweat when the weather turns warm. Mold grows silently in the corners, black, green, and strange. You do not name it. You just live with it. You cough sometimes. Your children wheeze. Your skin itches. If you hang clothes too long in one place, they sprout fuzz. Every year, someone suggests building better homes, stronger homes, but no one has time. The river doesn't care about your dreams. It only flows. It only rises. It only waits. You grow what you can. Rice, in some parts, millet, beans, turnips. These are not grand Italian vineyards or golden fields of wheat. These are soggy, anxious farms. You walk through your rows ankle deep in sludge. The plants survive, barely. The roots rot if the flood comes too late. The soil compacts and turns sour. Fungus claims your crops before you do. And then there is hunger. You live on a thin broth made from boiled grain and bitter greens. Once a week, maybe, some cheese. Less often, salted meat. But mostly, you eat black bread, made from a mix of rye, chestnut flour, and whatever else you can grind. It fills your stomach. It turns to paste in your mouth, and it carries the risk of ergot, a mold that grows in wet rye and brings hallucinations, convulsions, and death. You don't know the cause. You call it a curse. Maybe the river spirits are angry. Maybe you didn't bury the dead deep enough last time the plague came through. Speaking of the dead, they don't stay buried. Not always. In the worst floods, entire graveyards wash out. The bones drift to the surface. Coffins bob in the streets. The priest tries to gather them, He lights candles. He says prayers. He burns incense until your eyes water. But it doesn't help. The river takes what it wants. Let's talk about the church, because it is the only building tall enough to offer safety in a flood. During the worst seasons, half the village moves inside. Straw pallets, makeshift hearths, coughing children in every corner. The priest preaches louder, hoping his voice drowns out the crying. The statue of St. Nicholas above the altar begins to tilt. One day, it falls. Everyone sees it as a sign. The church teaches that the river is punishment for sin. That suffering here means less suffering in the afterlife. That God cleanses through water, but no one feels clean. Everyone feels tired and wet. You might think the Po Valley had nothing to offer, but in truth, it was strategically vital. Fertile land, river access, trade routes, so it attracted conflict. Armies passed through. Mercenaries were hired by distant lords. They took what they needed: grain, animals, women. They did not care that you were starving. They did not care that your house was half underwater. They cared only that your door had hinges, your barn had roof tiles, your sons could be conscripted. There was no stable government. The valley was carved up among city-states, dukes, bishops, and ambitious merchants. One year you were part of Milan, the next, Parma. Then Venice tried to tax you. Then a warlord from Ferrara burned your town and demanded loyalty. You gave it, because what else could you give? You did not have rights. You had mud, that was all. In the rare dry summers, the village worked harder than ever, reinforcing the levees, replanting the fields, rebuilding the tools that had floated away. Children helped. The elderly carried what they could. Hope returned for a moment. Then autumn came, then the rains, and the cycle began again. There were songs about the river, low, sad ones. Mothers sang them to their children. Farmers hummed them in the fields. The words were simple. The river comes, the river goes, the river takes the ones it knows. Everyone knew someone who had been taken, and yet you stayed. Because what choice did you have? The cities were full, the mountains were cruel, the sea was too far. Here, at least, you understood the rules. Flood, rebuild, starve, pray. Life in the Po River Valley was a lesson in acceptance. Acceptance that not all lands are blessed. Acceptance that not all rivers are lifelines. Sometimes, they are graves. So now, as you close your eyes, imagine the sound of slow-moving water. Imagine the creak of a sodden beam, the drip, drip, drip from the rafters, the musty smell of damp wool and wet ash. Let it lull you. Let it carry you gently, the way the Po carries everything, slowly, inexorably, toward the sea. Let it be quiet now. Let the flood wait until morning, a cold wind rustling the black pine trees of an endless forest, steep mountain cliffs casting long shadows over your tiny wooden home, and wolves howling somewhere just beyond the tree line. This is not the land of fairy tales. This is not a place where knights in shining armor ride through green meadows to save the day. This is the Carpathian Mountains, in the heart of medieval Eastern Europe. And here, even time feels afraid to pass too quickly. You live in a village that is barely a clearing, just a few huts clinging to a slope. The forest looms on every side, dark and wet. The ground is cold even in summer. In winter, it is ice. And above you, perched on a high crag, like a predator watching from a distance, is the castle. Stone walls, narrow windows, smoke rising from its chimney. That is where your lord lives. And he is not kind. The lords of the Carpathians are not merely nobles. They are masters, absolute and unquestioned. They answer to no parliament, no town council, no kindly monarch in the West. They rule as little kings, each one the final word on life, death, and suffering. Their lands stretch from one mountain pass to another, their borders marked not with signs but with gallows. You are a serf, bound to this land, not just by tradition, but by law. You cannot leave. You cannot marry without permission. You cannot hunt, even in the deep woods, where your ancestors once roamed freely. The deer belong to the Lord. The trees belong to the Lord. Even the wolves, it seems, do his bidding. If the harvest is poor, and it usually is, you still owe your share. Grain, chickens, firewood, your time. If you don't have enough to give, he takes it in flesh. A son for his army, a daughter for his household, a finger, sometimes for a lesson. The castle, when you glimpse it through the mist, seems unreal. Too high, too quiet. You've never been inside. You never want to be. That's where people go and don't return. Rumors say there are dungeons beneath the earth, where chains rust into bones and screams echo for years. No one questions the rumors. They are probably true. You live in a hut made of logs, sealed with moss and mud. The roof leaks. The floor is dirt. You sleep beside your animals for warmth. A pig, if you're lucky. A goat. Sometimes a chicken or two. Your wife snores. Your children shiver under a single blanket. Outside, the wind sings through the trees like a ghost remembering something painful. There is no village healer, only the old woman who knows herbs and speaks to the forest. She lives at the edge of the woods. Some say she's a witch. The priest says to avoid her, but the priest does not cure fevers. The old woman does. So you bring her bread, or coins if you have any, or sometimes just a quiet thank you. And when the fever hits, and it always does, you pray to God, to Mary, to saints you can't name, to the old gods. Maybe, if no one is listening, the winters are long, snow piles as high as the windows. The sun disappears for days. You burn peat and dung for warmth. The smoke chokes the air. Your throat hurts, always. The cold settles into your joints like a second skeleton. Your children go pale. Your teeth rot. You eat mostly sour cabbage and black bread, scraping mold from the edges. And the forest. The forest never stops watching. There are things in it. Wolves. Yes, bears. But also stories. The villagers speak of creatures with red eyes. Men who drink blood. Women who fly at night and steal infants from their cradles. You laugh, but not too loudly. You bar your door. You hang garlic by the window. The church warns of sin, of devils, of hellfire. But hell is here, in this valley, with its ice and its silence, and its shadows that move when no one is looking. And always, there is the Lord. He does not ride out often, but when he does, it is with a black cloak and a company of grim-faced riders. They come at night. They knock on doors. They take what they need. The sound of hoofbeats is a signal to hide, to snuff candles, to silence babies. The taxes are never enough. Every year he demands more. First a portion of your crops, then a day of your labor, then the roof over your head. It is never enough, and you cannot say no. Justice is whatever the Lord decides it is. If your neighbor steals from you, he is whipped. If the Lord's steward steals your winter grain, you say nothing. If a noble's hounds trample your garden, you apologize. And rebellion, that is a quick road to a shallow grave. Sometimes you dream of escape, running into the forest, hiding in the highlands, disappearing into the trees. But you've seen what happens to those who try. Their bodies are left on display. One man was skinned and hung upside down at the village crossroads. His face became a warning, his silence a message. So you stay, you endure. There are festivals. Sometimes the church demands them. Days of rest, celebration, fasting and feasting. But even then, joy feels like a borrowed thing. You drink sour beer. You dance around a pole. You forget the hunger for a night. But when the fire dies down, the cold returns, and so does the dread. The only real hope you have is your children. You teach them to survive. You teach them not to trust anyone in armor. You teach them to plant when the ground thaws, to gather mushrooms that won't kill, to sharpen a blade in secret. And when they ask about the castle on the hill, you tell them not to look too long. The Carpathians are not generous. The mountains give little and take much. Rock slides crush roads. Wolves take livestock. The rivers freeze or flood without warning. And when disease comes, it moves fast. A single cough, and half the village is gone by spring. There are no hospitals, no letters, no laws. Really, only the mountain, the forest, the cold, the fear. This is not the land of Gothic fiction. It is not a story. It is your life. A real place, with real people, where darkness settled not just in the woods, but in every corner of the soul. A place where feudalism was not a system, it was a sentence. And now, as you settle into sleep, imagine the wind moving through tall trees. Hear the distant howl of something not quite a wolf. Feel the cold stone of the mountains watching, silent and patient. The fire is low. Your children are quiet. The door is bolted. Just for tonight, you are safe. Let the forest have its secrets. Let the castle stay far away, and let yourself rest. Picture heat that sticks to your skin like a second, suffocating layer. Then add the faint, not so distant sound of drums, marching boots, metal scraping metal. Welcome to the Latin East, the patchwork of crusader states carved into the Levant after the First Crusade. It's not paradise. It's not even home. It's a fever dream of war, sandwiched between desert, sea, and enemies on every side. You live in a small fortified town. It was once a prosperous village with a mosque and stone houses. Now, it has a church with Latin crosses, high walls, and a lot of angry neighbors. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch. These are the grand names for a few square miles of rocky, wind-blasted terrain, where survival is measured in days between sieges. You're not a noble crusader. You're not even a soldier. You're one of the unfortunate ones who came for salvation or riches and ended up living in a mud brick shack outside the castle walls. You're surrounded by foreigners, Franks, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Arabs, Bedouins, none of whom trust each other. You don't even speak the local languages. You're from Flanders, or maybe Normandy, or a quiet village near the Rhine, but now you're here. Here, where the water is never clean, where the bread is always stale, where the sun scorches the fields and the air smells of sweat and ash. Let's talk about food. There isn't much. Wheat is hard to grow. The ground is dry and cracked, and the irrigation systems have either broken or been sabotaged. You eat flatbread, lentils, sometimes goat. If you're lucky, there's a bit of date paste. Most days, you live off porridge and memories of food that didn't taste like dust. Your body weakens. Your skin cracks. Your stomach always hurts. But worse is the thirst. You drink water from a cistern, and every sip is a gamble. Sometimes it's just muddy. Sometimes it brings dysentery. If the cistern is dry, you boil river water. If the river hasn't been poisoned by the enemy, and there's always an enemy. The Muslim armies from surrounding lands want their cities back. The locals who were here before you came with your cross and sword haven't forgotten. They raid at night. They burn crops. They poison wells. And they hate you. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represent. A foreign army, a stranger in sacred land. And you're afraid. Always. You hear rumors. You hear about a fortress taken, its defenders flayed alive, about a caravan ambushed, its travelers left to bake in the sun. You don't know if the stories are true, but they might be, and that's enough. The Crusader states don't have strong armies. They have militias, volunteers, mercenaries, overworked knights. When there's a battle, the castle calls for levy troops, and that includes you. You don't have training. You have a rusted helmet, a wooden spear, and prayers. If the enemy comes with cavalry, you die. If they come with siege engines, you die slower. Sieges are common, exciting, if you're lucky enough to be watching from a distance. But you're not. You're inside the walls. And that means days, sometimes weeks, of fear and filth. You live on half rations, quarter rations. You watch the rats disappear, then the cats. Then you start to wonder if old leather boots might be chewable. You boil them. You chew. You don't talk about it. You just do what everyone else does. Wait and waste away. The air during a siege is thick. Fires smolder. Arrows whistle overhead. Every knock on the wall feels like thunder in your chest. You sleep in shifts, if you sleep at all. And every morning, you check the gate. Is it still closed? Is the banner still flying? If it's not, you know what's coming. You don't fight to the death. You don't run. You kneel. And you beg. Let's talk about religion, because it's everywhere. Priests bless the water. Priests bless the weapons. Priests bless the graves. And there are many graves. You came to this land because the Pope promised eternal salvation. If you fought and died here, your sins would be washed away, so they said. But the Pope isn't here. He's in Rome. You're in a land where everyone is holy, and no one is kind. There are Muslim holy men, Jewish scholars, Eastern Orthodox priests, and you're told to hate them all. Except sometimes you trade with them, and sometimes they save your life, And sometimes you wonder if maybe the real sin was coming here at all, but you can't say that out loud. The heat, even in spring, is unbearable. Armor turns into a torture device. You walk slowly, drink constantly, and sweat until your clothes cling like second skin. In summer, the heat is worse. The stones burn your feet through your shoes. And still, you stand watch. Because someone has to. There are no seasons. Not like you remember. No crisp autumns. No snowy winters. Just dust and sun and blood. The economy is a joke. Coins change hands, but no one trusts them. You barter more than you buy. Cloth for bread, salt for wine, a bucket of water for a chicken. The nobles control the caravans, and they get the best of everything. You get leftovers, and sometimes not even that. The locals have learned to live with war. You have not. They walk past corpses without blinking. You still look away. They know where the hidden wells are. You don't. They've seen a dozen conquerors come and go. You still believe your king matters. Let's talk about trust, because there is none. Your neighbors might be spies. Your guards might take bribes. The merchant who smiles at you today might be passing messages tomorrow. No one knows who's loyal. No one knows who's next. And so, you whisper. You avoid eye contact. You keep your head down. Sometimes, there's peace. A truce. A treaty. A season without blood. The market's open. Fresh fruit appears. Wine flows. People laugh. You laugh too, nervously, because you know it won't last. It never does. There is always another skirmish, another holy war, another call to arms, another king from Europe who thinks he can reclaim the land with a fresh army of starving men and misplaced hope. And always, it's you who suffers. You didn't come here to fight. You came because someone promised a better life, a land of milk and honey, a new Jerusalem. What you got was a war zone, where your soul was the currency, and your body the cost. At night, you lie on a straw mat. The air is thick. You smell smoke from a distant fire. You hear the call to prayer echoing from a minaret. You don't understand the words, but the voice is beautiful. It makes you wonder, for a moment, who the real heretics are. And then the bell rings, and someone screams, and you remember where you are. The Latin East, a dream that became a nightmare, a promised land turned prison. You don't know how long you'll last, but for now, you keep breathing, because that's all you can do. There are no walls here, no thick forests, no mountains to hide behind, just the open land, and wind that never stops. This is the Mongol frontier, and living here means waking up every day with the quiet understanding that today might be the day you either join the horde or get crushed beneath it. It is the 13th century. The Mongol Empire is not just rising, it is consuming. Villages, cities, cultures, and entire armies fall like dry leaves before the wind of its advance. But you're not in the heart of the empire. You're at the edge, that uneasy, undefined space where the land stops being yours and starts belonging to someone stronger. Your town might be in Eastern Europe, or in Central Asia, or Persia. It doesn't really matter. If you're near the frontier, then you already know what it feels like to hear hooves before you see riders. The ground vibrates, the air trembles, and then, from the horizon, they come, Mongol scouts, fast and quiet, reading the earth like a book. Sometimes they pass by, sometimes they don't. You're a peasant, or a merchant, or a monk, someone with no sword and no say in what happens next. And you have no idea if these men come to burn your home, demand your sons, or offer protection with a smile that means nothing. All you know is you should probably run, or kneel, or hide. There is no right answer. Let's say they take you alive. You are now a subject of the Khan. That means taxes. That means pledges. That means feeding their horses and learning to bow with your hands empty. It might mean conscription, or it might just mean giving up whatever you thought you owned. Your grain, your animals, your peace. If you're lucky, they leave behind a governor, someone from far away, who speaks in a tongue you don't understand, and collects silver that vanishes into caravans headed east. If you're not lucky, they leave behind soldiers, or no one at all. And the next group that comes through has no idea you've already been conquered. But that's just one version of the nightmare. Sometimes, they don't want subjects. They want to make an example. Maybe your city resisted. Maybe someone insulted the Khan 3 rulers ago. Maybe it's Tuesday. You remember the day it happened. You were cooking millet. The baby was sick. The dogs barked. Then came the siege. You didn't know the Mongols had siege engineers from China. Catapults, gunpowder, battering rams. Your walls meant nothing. The defense crumbled. Then came the fire. Then the screams. Then silence. Everyone you loved, gone. You survived, somehow. Buried under ash, or hidden in a well. But now you live with the memory, and you wander the ruins. And when people ask, what happened here? You say one word, Mongols. That's all they need to hear. Let's talk about daily life. You rebuild, because you have to. You dig in dry soil. You patch roofs with stolen thatch. You start again, always knowing you might not finish. Trade is risky. Sometimes caravans arrive with spices and silk. Sometimes they vanish. Bandits have grown bold, but so have the tax collectors. There's always someone demanding something. You're surrounded by diverse cultures: Turks, Persians, Russians, Armenians, Georgians, Arabs. You share markets, roads, and sometimes religions, but peace is thin. Tensions boil. Converts are eyed suspiciously. Foreign soldiers patrol the roads. Even your prayers feel like acts of negotiation. And then there's the military draft. The Mongols are always fighting someone. China, India, Poland, Egypt. Doesn't matter. They need bodies. If you're young and strong, you're given a bow and a saddle, and told to ride east, or west, or into the mountains. The Mongols fight like no one else. Fast, unforgiving. You live on fermented mare's milk and dried meat. You learn to sleep in the saddle. You shoot backwards while galloping, and you follow the banner. Not because you believe, but because you want to live. If you fight well, they promote you. If you disobey, they execute you. Simple. And you, who once prayed in a quiet chapel, or worked a still field, now find yourself setting cities ablaze, tearing down walls, trampling unfamiliar villages in the name of a ruler you've never seen. And then there's the plague. The Mongols don't just bring war, they bring rats, fleas, sickness. As trade routes open, so do veins of death. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but whispers have. And when it does come, it will ride the same roads, sail the same ships, and spread through the same frontier towns like a storm of silence. Let's not forget the climate. The steppe is harsh. Summers are hot and dusty. Winters, brutal. No trees for shelter. Just wind, snow, and wolves. Horses shiver. Water freezes. You burn dung for heat. The children cough constantly. Every morning, you check who's still breathing. You might join a caravan for safety. Merchants travel together now, bundled in wool, clutching talismans. The Silk Road is open, but dangerous. Bandits don't fear gods. You sleep with a knife. You trust no one. You might convert. Mongols tolerate many faiths, but they prefer obedience. A monk might become a court scribe. A priest might be hanged for treason. You learn to read faces quickly. There are benefits, they say. Roads are safer now. You can trade across half the world. Ideas flow. Technologies spread. That's true. For cities, for nobles, for the favored, but not for you. You live on the edge, not just geographically, but emotionally. You're always on the brink of something. Famine, invasion, conscription, plague, and above all, change. Too fast, too brutal, too final. You once had a family name, a village with a name, a river you fished from, a church you sang in, a routine. Now you have a bag, a cloak, a story you don't like to tell, and a long, bitter memory of horses. At night, you sleep light. You tie your boots near the door. You hide a coin in your boot heel. You keep a string of garlic above your head, not for vampires, but because your grandmother did. You pray, if you still remember how, and you dream of quiet, of stillness, of not waking up to hoofbeats. But deep down, you know, on the Mongol frontier, stillness is only ever temporary. The wind picks up, the dust returns, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, riders are gathering again. So, now we've wandered across deserts, trudged through snow-covered steppes, sunk into swamps, and crawled through rat-infested alleys. We've looked at life under siege, under kings, under priests, under no one at all. And the truth, at the end of it all, is simple and sad. It didn't matter where you lived. It was probably awful, because if you were alive in the medieval world, and not rich, titled, or armored in gold, you were probably a peasant. And being a peasant wasn't living, it was surviving. Barely, quietly, painfully. Maybe you woke up in a burned-out village in the Latin East, where the morning routine meant checking the horizon for raiders. Or maybe you started your day in a cold polished mine, coughing through salt dust while praying the tunnel wouldn't collapse. Perhaps you called the Highlands of Scotland home, and all you could count on was the chill, the hunger, and the threat of a rival clan showing up for your sheep and your teeth. Or maybe you were in medieval London, where filth flowed through the streets like water, and the air always carried the smell of something rotting, usually bodies, sometimes dreams. Didn't matter, because being a medieval peasant meant you had no power, no privacy, and no protection. You owed taxes to someone. You owed labor to someone else. And if war came, and it always did, you owed your life to a cause you never chose. Your daily life was a pattern of repetition and fear. Wake up, if you made it through the night. Work the land, if it hadn't failed. Eat what little was left. Drink water and hope it didn't make you sick. Say a prayer you didn't believe, to a God you didn't understand, and fall asleep on a lice-ridden mat. Repeat. You weren't literate. You couldn't read your own rights, if you had any. You knew the seasons, the stars, the moods of your livestock. That was your knowledge. That was survival. The world around you was full of lords and priests and taxmen and foreign armies. They all wanted something from you, your labor, your soul, your blood, and all you had to offer was what little life you carried in your body. You might think one place would be better than another. That maybe, just maybe, living in a monastery in Italy beat scraping oats from a cold bowl in Denmark. That perhaps the sunny fields of Castile offered more joy than the black bread of Novgorod. But over and over, across every region, across every climate, the pattern repeats. If the land wasn't burning, it was freezing. If the water wasn't flooded, it was poisoned. If the war wasn't happening now, it was coming soon. And if the plague wasn't already here, it was on the next caravan. Peasants weren't people in the eyes of the powerful. They were numbers, in tax rolls, in census records, in military levies. They were bodies to be moved, buried, or forgotten. Even the church, that great supposed equalizer, offered little comfort. Yes, your suffering might have purpose, but only after you died. Not that you had much time to wait. Life expectancy was short. Children died often. Women gave birth in pain, in dirt, surrounded by fear. A broken bone could become a death sentence. An infection from a splinter could take your arm. A cold in the wrong season could take your life. And then there was weather, the great silent killer. A hard winter didn't just mean you were cold. It meant your animals died. Your seeds didn't sprout. You starved. You froze. You waited for someone to save you. No one did. Still, you stayed, because you couldn't leave. Travel was dangerous. Bandits roamed the roads. Laws kept you bound to the land. And besides, where would you go? One lord's fields were as miserable as the next. One town's disease was another's war. You didn't dream big. You dreamed of bread, of warm shoes, of a year without frost. That was enough. But somehow, in all this misery, you endured. That's what makes medieval peasants not just victims, but survivors. You endured cold, war, hunger, fear, and death. You raised families. You sang songs. You passed down stories and traditions. You worked land that hated you and made it grow. You lived, somehow, in a world that wanted you dead. And yet, you kept waking up. You weren't a knight. You weren't a queen. You weren't a bishop or a scribe or a merchant prince. But you were the backbone of the world. And even if history doesn't remember your name, it stands on your broken, calloused shoulders. So maybe the question isn't, where was the worst place to live in medieval times? Maybe the better question is, was there anywhere that wasn't? And the answer is, probably not, unless you were lucky enough to be born into silk, steel, or a very well-defended castle. For the rest, it was the same: mud, hunger, fear, work, war, and waiting. But here you are. You made it to the end of the story. And maybe, just maybe, That's enough. Now, let it all go. Close your eyes. Forget the cold, the wars, the rats, the lords, and drift into the quiet nothingness of sleep, where there are no taxes, no raids, no sieges, just silence and rest.